Hey guys, Coach Keith Keppner here with this video. Maybe a little bit of controversy, perhaps, because I'm going to go against my old school roots a little bit for some people. But maybe you'll be in complete agreement with me after watching this whole video. Make sure you watch it till the end. And if you aren't already, make sure you like, subscribe, share, comment. Really appreciate your support. Awesome community that I'm happy to be a part of and proud to be a part of here on this channel. All right, guys, so I'm going to talk about bag gloves versus regular gloves and give you my thoughts, not only from my own experiences, but from my father's experiences of boxing amateur in the 60s and everything else. And of course, I'm going to do my best to be nuanced here, to not paint things in a black or white picture, and to get the closest to what I can to what is truth behind our training, because you see a lot of things come and go. Some things stay, and some things stay and they are good. Some things stay and they aren't good. So let's talk about it. So bag gloves versus regular gloves. Too often, there's a lot of mystique that I see that gets built around certain training methods. The idea that you have to, like I talked about in the last video, that you have to jump rope, that you have to hit the speed bag, that you have to do these certain things. And just because old school boxers did these, or all boxers or almost all boxers have done these things, doesn't mean it is an automatic cause of effect or of success, right? Doesn't mean it's the thing that actually created the success. It could just be something that they all do. And that's where I see guys will do crazy things like with weight cutting stuff. They'll drink some tea and like some lemon tea or some this tea or whatever, and some spicy tea, and they lose weight because they're doing all the other stuff to cut weight. But then they'll tell other guys, yeah, you know what you got to do is drink this spicy tea and that will do it for you, versus all the other stuff that they were doing to cut weight, which makes a whole lot more sense. All right, anyway, let's jump into it. Make sure you stick around to the end, because I'm going to tell you my own theory on why bag gloves were created. All right, so you don't want to miss it. I'm a little bit biased. I'm a little bit biased on using the specific things that you're going to use for your sport, right? So if you're a baseball player, use a baseball bat that is around the same size or weight as the baseball you're going to be using. If you play basketball, it's probably good to play with a competition size basketball. And that's, I bet you, what most guys do. And same thing with anything and everything else. Okay, if you're a world-class runner, Olympian marathon runner, you're probably going to use similar shoes and things like that, similar clothes. Just you're gonna recreate the same environment and the same equipment. Not that you're not going to ever do things differently, right? And mix it up. And there's a time and a place for that, and we'll talk about that. But I am definitely biased to that concept of said specific adaptations to imposed demands. Word to the wise, guys. Back in the day, when Sugar Ray Robinson fought Joe Louis, those gloves were not 10-ounce gloves or 8. Some of them were smaller. Some of them were 6. I don't have the exact data in front of me, but I definitely know some of the fights that you see from before the 50s, those guys had smaller gloves than what we have now, like what you see with this picture here with these guys. All right. Now, what I've noticed is that guys that will use smaller gloves in their training, right? Because I'm going to talk about the benefits and the drawbacks of using bag gloves. But I've noticed something. When guys use small gloves in training all the time, and then they have to spar, and we all need to spar to get better, right? And particularly, obviously, if you're a beginner or intermediate, sparring is about the most, well, excuse me, is essentially the most essential thing you can do in preparation for your fight. Because if you don't get that time and you're kind of newer to this thing, you don't get your time in the ring, and you go against someone who has had a lot of time in the ring, you're going to be in big trouble, right? But what I've noticed time and time again, guys who train with smaller gloves all the time, like 12-ounce gloves and things like that, then when they need to get their sparring rounds in, they put on the 16s. They're not used to the 16s. Their arms get extra tired. They're not used to it. All right. So there's something right there to be thought about. And that is that, what are you preparing for? Now, of course, like I said earlier, specific adaptations to impose demands, you're getting ready to, as an amateur, fight in 10 or 12 ounce gloves, or as a pro in 8 or 10 ounce gloves. But because we're going to be sparring in at least 14-ounce gloves, you probably need to be training in at least 14 to 16-ounce gloves half the time, so you get used to that size. Also, as well, do an interesting note just in terms of just training and glove size, right? Because this video is also just about all of that versus just bag gloves and me saying they suck or they're great, and or something in between. I've noticed with guys that I've had who wear larger than 16-ounce gloves to spar, like 18-ounce gloves, that depending how the weight is distributed, right? But if it's a lot up here to create more padding, right, which is the reason why you'd have a heavier glove, is to create more padding generally. But you could also argue like a conditioning benefit. But anyway, I noticed that they don't get as good at defense, or their defense lacks. I remember one guy that comes to mind that I got his defense pretty darn sharp, a pro fighter, and he had some hand issues for a little bit or whatever, so he went up to 18-ounce gloves to give himself some extra cushion, and then he kind of stuck with it because he liked he felt like it got him in better condition or something like that. But I noticed his defense started becoming just pure ear muffing because he could get away with it with the larger gloves. Versus that's where I like to use some 14s sometimes, like when I boxed, or some 16s that have more of the weight down in the wrist area, kind of like maybe almost like a Cleto Reyes type glove, even though I have certain things I don't like about those gloves. But that is a benefit because you're going to learn where your hand needs to be exactly for those competition size gloves. Also work defense using your competition size gloves. If you're always using 16s, big gloves, it's just slightly different. All right. And if the shape is different, because a lot of these gloves have different shapes. Now, let's talk about first bag glove advantages, because I'm a big proponent of, I have a nuanced opinion on this. Okay. So I'm not going to tell you bag gloves suck, and I'm not going to tell you they're the best thing ever. All right. But in the process, you'll either learn some stuff or maybe view things a slightly different way. I hope so. Or if you have your own thoughts and you completely disagree with that, comment below. Thanks. Bag gloves, right? You see Sugar Ray Robinson right here with Joe Louis and hitting the bag. What's he wearing? He's wearing bag gloves. That might be the secret to Robinson's success. Maybe if you wore bag gloves, you'd have the same success as Robinson. Let's dive into the advantages. Okay, guys? So first is you get a feel of what is knuckles and what isn't. Okay? These are not your knuckles. These are your fingers. These are knuckles. Okay? And you want to make sure you hit with those things when you hit things in boxing, because that's the sport of boxing. You don't need to be hitting, pawing with your fingers or slapping. Okay? Slapping is straight out illegal. And hitting with the fingers is definitely not as optimal as the knuckles, particularly when you have a pro wrap on with all that gauze built up on the knuckles and then tape all around it to secure it. That stuff smash into that glove to make it as hard as possible. You want to hit them with the knuckle surface area of the glove in those situations, definitely. So with bag gloves versus always using like training gloves, like 16-ounce gloves, a 16-ounce gloves, you can be hitting finger all day long and not really know it. Be like kind of like this the whole time, not even know it. I see it every day in the gym. Every day in the gym. So it's going to help with the accuracy of that, but just accuracy in general, because it's just a smaller target. Hitting with the hooks, right? Coming around and getting that slight bend to the wrist so you hit with the knuckles on your hooks when you come around. Very important to know what that is, and it is easier to be aware of that when you're using bag gloves. I guess you could say it's kind of maybe like barefoot running. I don't know a lot about barefoot running, but I guess the arguments for it that you get a better feel for how to actually land versus letting a shoe kind of just allow you to kind of run in a goofy way. And I mean, I can see the logic behind that, but I'm sure it doesn't apply all the time to every situation. All right. Now, you can learn proper form, without ever using a bag glove. During my time boxing, I never used a bag glove, and I got to the point of always hitting with my knuckles, because my dad was watching for it and I was watching for it, because it was number one. It was number one, got to be hitting with our knuckles all the time. And if it wasn't knuckles, it was a hook, it wasn't knuckles. If it was a straight shot, it wasn't knuckles. It was like completely unacceptable in training. And so that type of studiousness to training is a way you can get around it. Now, I have had success with having people take off their gloves and hit the bag with just wraps on, right? Or hit the bag with no gloves on sometimes. Prefer people wear something on their hands, but just, for a time, just for a moment to work on something. The way they're connecting, they're not feeling that they're not hitting knuckles. And I get them just kind of hit easy on the bag and snap and get that squeeze and make sure that they are hitting with those knuckles. And then actually, before I jump to the idea of overspeed, is I also want to talk about what's good about the bag gloves as well. As you can easily see, or with just wraps on, you can easily see if someone's always squeezing or if they're just kind of tense with their hands all the time, and if they are squeezing when they hit. Because again, when you have this big cushiony thing on you with a wrap on your hand inside a glove, you can be hitting a bag and not locking as tight as you can versus the bag glove or no glove and just wraps on. It's gonna help you be more aware of that. Also more aware of right after you hit, making sure you relax, making sure that while you throw your punches, the other hand comes back relaxed. If you watch my video on you get loose, you go to the top, people will get slow, tight, less powerful on combinations because their fists stay tight after they throw their one punch, and then they come back. Now that's tight and everything just gets tighter and tighter versus hit, relax, relax, relax. The opposite hand needs to relax right after it hits. Now, let's talk about the overspeed effect. I'm not sure what the modern or the most recent research on this is, but it makes some sense to me. I know they've used this in some forms of athletic training, but the idea of to help your nervous system feel what faster is, okay? So if you're always training, let's say with 16-ounce gloves, you know kind of what your max speed is with that size glove. But you put on the lighter gloves, you're like, whoa, this is fast. And if you consistently train in 16s and you put on some like 10s or 8s, you're like, dang, this is like, I definitely feel faster. So I think there's a neurological benefit because your body can kind of learn what it feels like to be faster. And I just have some theories, just not supported by evidence, but, or maybe it is with overspeed training. Please comment below if you have some data that supports overspeed training. I know they use some of these things with maybe running downhill and stuff like that. But nevertheless, I know that at times when I box, I would purposely wear some smaller gloves, lighter gloves to do shadow boxing or no gloves just to get that real feel of speed and then try to translate that to the heavier gloves. All right. A little bit of a side note there, but it is what it is. And the last one is actually what I already talked about. So squeezing at the right time, snapping those punches. And so you got ahead of myself on that one. So those are the points, guys, for what I see as the advantages. People could say like, oh, it toughens up your hands and stuff like that. Yeah, you could say that, but I have some thoughts about that later on. All right. Now let's talk about bag glove downsides, right? With everything, there's trade-offs in life. There's upside, there's a downside. Let's talk about it. Bag gloves, these bag gloves are cheap. The ones that are on this picture, because they'll like throw these in with bags, heavy bags, or at least they used to for a while. Everlast would. But you go online, you look up bag gloves. They're not cheap. They're not cheap. So you'd be better off, or I think, because I try to be conservative with how I spend money. You'd be better off not buying the bag gloves, and maybe using wraps like I'm talking about, things like that. Even gardening gloves instead of bag gloves. Okay, so, and we'll talk about it. You'll hear my theory about bag gloves at the end. Now, if you only use bag gloves to hit the bag, you might have more hand issues. I'm not saying you will, but you might. Okay, I know a lot of people that get knuckle issues by hitting a bag with 16-ounce gloves on and hand wraps. So using that logic, I would say if you continually use them, you might start developing some knuckle issues. Now, this also leads me to the other point that if you look at a lot of bags back in the day, look at this. This guy's not that powerful. I mean, he's not as powerful to be able to lift up let's say 100-pound heavy bag. I bet you that heavy bag is like 50 pounds, maybe 75. All right. But it's a little softer. It's not quite as heavy. And that's where a lot of times you can see those guys, old school guys with the bag gloves on, they're moving around the bag. The bag is light. They're not just sitting and digging on it. And when they do want to sit and dig on it, they have someone hold it for them. Versus now the modern day bags, they're more just heavy. I'm not saying there weren't heavy bags back then that were super heavy and just would stay there, but they're more just heavy and frankly hard. And maybe you could say that's because less people use bag gloves. I don't know, just to throw a random idea out there. So therefore they can get away with being heavier. And back then they always used bag gloves. So therefore the bag needed to be a little bit softer. But of course, what I personally, my own experience is that you can have a bag that's too dang hard. And, the human body does have some hard points on it, but generally it's not that hard. And it gives a little bit more than like a rock solid bag. Okay. So if you have a soft bag, absolutely, or a softer bag, absolutely, you can get away with hitting with bag gloves and not have any issues whatsoever. But if you have like a 100-pound standard modern day heavy bag, you probably won't be able to get away with it, or at least not for that long if you hit hard. Now, like I mentioned previously, the conditioning aspect. You're always hitting the bag, heavy bag with bag gloves. Those are super light. They're like gardening mitts or just mittens, or like having no gloves. So there may be a deconditioning effect that you will achieve through that. Now, you could argue that you're going to hit the bag for your pure technique work with the bag gloves to make sure you're hitting correctly, for focusing on how to produce power shots by squeezing at the right time, things like that, as well as, like I mentioned earlier, maybe some overspeed aspects of training. You can definitely make that argument. But as far as conditioning factor of preparing yourself for using 10 or 12 ounce gloves or 8-ounce gloves when you fight, or sparring with 14 to 16-ounce gloves, then you're going to run into a problem. So again, beginner, intermediate, you definitely want to probably at least do a good amount of your bag work with gloves somewhere around the size that you fight with and that you spar with. All right. Now, here is my theory, my thought. And I remember talking to my dad about this when he and I were training together. My theory, based off of the information he told me and just my time around the sport, for why bag gloves were invented. Okay. Because back in the day, like this is a picture of the CYO gym where my dad fought out of in Chicago. And there were three types of gloves back in the day that were commonly used. Okay. There's your bag gloves, the gardener mitt style gloves. Then you have your sparring gloves. You see these boys they have their sparring gloves on. They're fatter. They're the 16s. They got more puffiness around the knuckles and everything. So, theoretically, it's going to help to not make the punch quite as hard. Then you have your fight gloves. Okay. So it's similar today. Today, it's typically kind of sparring gloves and fight gloves. Now, granted, most serious fighters, and when I say serious fighters, I just mean even people who are fighting consistently as an amateur, they're going to have a pair of gloves that they use for hitting the bag. They're going to have a pair of gloves for sparring. And then, of course, they might have a pair of fight gloves that they use for certain things on their own. But if you're an amateur, you get those provided at a fight. And typically, unless you're a really high level pro, you're not bringing in your own fight gloves. You're probably using the ones that are provided by the commission. Okay. Now, when you look at this, though, think about your time in the gym. If you take, for instance, here, another picture of the CYO gym. You take this guy tall guy with all these young guys. He has sparring gloves on right now, right? Nice and padded. Now, what's inside of those gloves? What's inside of those gloves? You know it. It's not foam. Looking around, see if I have like a glove over here. I don't. But it's not foam. It's not some type of synthetic material. It's horsehair. Okay? And horsehair, I don't think it's any better than the modern day material. And I think it might be worse, as shown by the fact that horsehair can easily be patted down, moved around because it's many hairs. So as you hit a lot with it and you hit things all the time with it, it's going to move that padding back and allow the knuckles to pierce through more, which create more of that blunt surface area with the wrap on that we want to avoid making contact with someone's face. okay? Particularly in sparring. Now, what my dad would tell me was when he was in the CYO gym is that if you were wearing the gloves like this guy has right here, the sparring gloves, and you hit the bag with it, they would cuss you out in a second, you know, freak out on you. Why is that? Because those gloves are expensive. Sparring gloves are expensive. And because of the horsehair, like I mentioned, they will get destroyed easily if you're just pounding nonstop on a heavy bag. Think about it, day after day, hitting. Because also, too, think about when you box, when you spar, you don't actually hit that much, right? You don't hit things that much. The most accurate boxers in the history of boxing have less than a 50% connect average to throwing ratio. So, but you wouldn't hit a bag, you'd hit a bag nonstop unless you're really just that uncoordinated. So day after day, if these kids are using these sparring gloves, what's going to happen? They're going to get matted down and destroyed. And everything was more expensive back then in relation to the, what the currency's weight was at that time. So yes, everything cost pennies and quarters and but it was a lot harder to make everything. Resources were more scarce. There was less mass production. Everything. And again, they had to use freaking, I guess, I don't know, cut off horses' tails or use horses that they killed, use that horsehair versus just synthetic material like the foam that's in gloves now. Okay? So those are valuable. You don't want to destroy those. So if you're going to hit a bag, what are you to do? Well, you don't want to cut up your hands, right? Because you can cut it up easy hitting maybe a bag that's leather or made out of some material and damage your knuckles a lot. And you don't want to bleed on a bag in a dirty gym. That's how you get freaking infections. You wear bag gloves, these mittens, the most cheapest thing you could imagine, right? Something that just covers your hand and stops you from getting cut. There's no magic about it. It's just something that you can put on to hit a bag with. And that's it. And so that's my theory. If you would, give me a like, give me a subscribe if you haven't already. Make sure you comment below. Leave your thoughts with me of what you think or what you have heard, because I wasn't around during the 60s and 70s, so I don't know. But basing off of what my dad told me of his time in gyms and also in the CYO gym, training under Chuck Bodak and Tony Zale, and his time, decades around the sport, and then of course my time, about 14 years coaching, 13 years coaching fighters. It's something that if you like to use it, cool. But I see guys, they'll come to the gym, typically a certain type of guy will come to the gym, kind of like a boxing nerd, right? And they'll have their bag gloves that they bought because they think that's what you're supposed to use, right? They think they're being classic or classy. And it's like, dude, like you have this glove now that we can't do a drill in, it's just gonna limit you. Like, just get some regular gloves, some regular training gloves that you can do a variety of things with, because they're so much cheaper now. And as you get better at this thing, maybe have one of those be your bag gloves and one of those be your sparring gloves. And that's it. All right, guys. Also, if you enjoy this, give me a super thanks. It really helps out, supports this channel, gives me more resources to help me do what I do. And I'll see you on the next one, guys. Appreciate you.